volume, or the first volume, whatever it is, at home, so I had to grab this other one from my office. I want to skip the Seafarer. Do I want to skip the Seafarer for now? Yeah, I want to skip the Seafarer for now. We may come back to it. We will come back to it. Let me rephrase that. We will come back to it. But I want to just jump right into Beowulf. If I remember right, because I don't have my book, I also don't have my syllabus. We're supposed to have an exam in 2 weeks, and it's supposed to be the first. Thank you. It's supposed to be the first hour of class. There's a possibility that exam could get pushed back 1 week, and then we'll just have to adjust things later on. If it doesn't get pushed back by a week, since we were supposed to start Beowulf last week, then the exam at the very least will be the last hour of class on whatever that day is, the 21st, I think it is. Okay? So there's a possibility the exam could be on the 28th rather than the 21st. Make sure that's turned on. Okay. Beowulf. How many of you have read Beowulf before? How many of you have read all of Beowulf before? Not a... how do I want to put this? Not a watered-down, namby-pamby version like AP English in high school. Okay, hands are kind of going down a little bit more. The reason I say that is because the translation that I know that it's been used in the last 5 years or so at least, in AP English courses in Tennessee at least, it's a really bad translation of Beowulf, or adaptation of Beowulf, I should say, by a guy named Burton Raffel. Okay. If you want a really good translation of Beowulf, the one that's in your textbook is, in my opinion, about the best one that's out there, by Roy Liuzza, who used to be at Tulane University and he's now at UTK. And the reason I'm talking about translation is because if you remember the last time we met, which was actually the first time we met, we talked a little bit about translation and what Bede says about when he copied down the Song of Cadman, Cadman's hymn. And Bede says every translation is essentially an act of interpretation. Okay? When you translate Beowulf, or when you read a translation of Beowulf, it's not the same, obviously, as reading Beowulf in the original. So even what we're going to do in here, you're not getting the full flavor of Beowulf. Because most, if not all of you, are English majors. If you want to get the real full flavor of Beowulf, there's a seat there and there's one down there. If you want to get the feel and real full flavor of Beowulf, what you have to do is you need to take a graduate course in Old English and then take the second semester graduate course in Beowulf, where you will read Beowulf in the original and translate it yourself. Okay? Now, regarding Beowulf, Roy Liuzza's translation in here, or introduction here, is very good. And at the end, he gives you a chronology, take it back, not a chronology. He gives you a genealogy and kind of a short, I'll find it, glossary of proper names, background material, genealogies and such. I'm going to email you something similar to that. I meant to do it today and completely slipped my mind. I'm going to email you a thing that I title something like A Guide to the Characters and Feuds in Beowulf. And it doesn't list every character in Beowulf, but it comes pretty close. And so there are an awful lot of names on it. And it includes, for many of them, who they are in feud with. Okay? So this idea of feud is going to become extremely important in Beowulf. Now, one of the reasons I use this edition with this translation is because Roy understands that about Beowulf. That Beowulf is about feuds and feuding and the whole notion of feud. If you were to read the Norton Anthology of English Literature and read the introduction to Beowulf in it, it says that feud is on the periphery of the poem. It's kind of unimportant. Okay? I don't remember who the person who writes the introduction for that is, but whoever it is, he's completely wrong. Completely wrong. The idea of feud is central to the poem. Okay? Now, what's meant, though, by the idea of feud? What do you mean by feud if you were to use that term today in popular consciousness?
Conflict.
What kind of conflict?
Ongoing. Between families
Okay, it can sometimes be between two families. What characterizes it? How do you practice your conflict?
killing each other.
Okay.
Vengeance.
Vengeance, killing each other.
Trash talking.
Okay. Do you use trash talking after somebody kills somebody in your family? Do you then go and cuss them up one side and down the other?
Maybe you cuss them up before. And
And then what?
then they kill someone in your family.
And then it escalates, right? I mean, the idea, the way this tends to happen or tends to work is you have ever increasing escalation of violence. Okay? Now, in Beowulf, the poem's going to open almost with feuding going on. Okay? We're going to see one character do something to other characters. Okay? And then gradually, Grendel's going to get introduced, and we're going to find out Grendel is involved in a feud with somebody. Okay? And then we're going to find out Grendel is descended from somebody, and that somebody entered into a feud with this other somebody, and it just keeps rippling on down throughout the entire poem. So that by the time the poem ends, even though Beowulf is dead by the end of the poem, this idea of feud is still ongoing. That is, Beowulf dies, but just because Beowulf dies, it doesn't mean his enemies suddenly go, oh darn, Beowulf's dead. Now we don't have anybody to feud against. Now we can't go exact our vengeance. No, that feud goes on and will have ramifications beyond Beowulf's death. Okay? A couple of things about the... Yes?
Is the feud also characterized by the handing down through generations?
Handing what down through generations?
The
The feud? Yes. Yes. Yeah, it doesn't usually stop with one character or one person, that kind of thing. A couple of other things, kind of background about the poem, its manuscript, things like that. Beowulf survives. He does say all this, doesn't he? Yeah. I was just making sure he includes all this. Beowulf survives in a unique manuscript called Cotton Vitellius A15. Right? It gets its name because of who owned it in the 17th century. A man named Sir Robert Bruce Cotton, who was a antiquarian. He was a collector of antiques and old things. Well, he had a huge collection of manuscripts. In fact, his collection of manuscripts essentially became the basis for the British Library, which is like one of the top 5 libraries in the world in terms of the number of collections. Okay? The Cotton collection is primarily manuscripts of Old and Middle English literature. Okay? Cotton Vitellius A15. So the Cotton part comes from his name, Sir Robert Bruce Cotton. Vitellius comes from how Cotton arranged the manuscripts in his library. If his library was a room like this, what Cotton had was individual bookcases all the way around the room, all 4 walls. Okay? And on top of each bookcase, he would have a bust of a Roman emperor or Roman Caesar. The bookcase that contained the manuscript that Beowulf is in had on its top the Roman Emperor Vitellius. Okay? So if you were to go to that bookcase and you go to the first shelf, A, so you have A, B, C, D, E, F, on down the line. And you go then from the inside from the left, the 15th item in, that's where the manuscript was. Okay? This is his version of Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress, if you want. Another poem we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is in Cotton Nero A10. So it's the Cotton collection, now in the British Museum. It's the manuscript that was under Nero's bust, first shelf, 10th item in from the side. That's how he had everything cataloged. Okay? Vitellius A10, Nero, etc., etc. The manuscript is, I said, it's unique. And what's meant by that, obviously, is there's none other like it. What we know of Beowulf, the character, the story, the poem, the events, we know only from this one manuscript. Beowulf as a character is not referred to or mentioned in any other Germanic literature whatsoever. Okay? Some of the characters in the poem we do know from other works. For example, Hygelac, Beowulf's uncle and the king of the land of the gates when Beowulf returns from his battle with Grendel. We know him from other stories. In fact, Hygelac is a real person. Okay? He was a real Gatish chieftain. Lived right around the first quarter of the 6th century. Died around 520. We know that historically. Okay? Hrothgar, we know from other Germanic literature. Beowulf, nothing. Okay? Totally unique. So if this manuscript, Cotton Vitellius A15, had burned in the Cotton Fire of 1731, you wouldn't have to read Beowulf. Because nobody would know about it. Similarly, you wouldn't have to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Because the manuscript that contains it is the only one with that poem. So it doesn't survive anywhere else. All right? This is pretty important because there are an awful lot of Old English works that were in Cotton's library. And when the library caught fire in 1731, literally what they did is they went up to the library and people just started throwing manuscripts out the window. Land in the Thames and stuff. And the British Museum today, the British Library today, the British Library still has the charred remains of a lot of the manuscripts that burned. That is, they burned literally to a crisp or to charcoal. But the curators at the time were smart enough to keep it. That is, they didn't say, oh, charcoal, look, and throw it out. Because now, through all kinds of, I can't even say the word anymore, spectrochromatography or something like that, we are able to read what are in, essentially, these clumps of charcoal. Because scientists can use this various kinds of technology to distinguish between charcoal and the ink that still exists inside the burned up manuscripts and such. Okay? So it's kind of interesting. Now the manuscript itself, this is an important distinction. The manuscript itself dates from about 1000 AD, give or take 25 years. So 975 to 1025. There's actually one scholar who says this isn't accurate, that it's actually, you can date it from about 990 to about 1015. But we'll take this, okay? 975 to 1025. When the manuscript was written, the poem that's in the manuscript, nobody's really sure. We obviously know what's called terminus aquem, the end date of it is. It can't be any later than this, obviously, because otherwise it wouldn't be in that manuscript. But when does it begin? When was Beowulf first composed? Whether orally, like, Homer supposedly composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, or wrote it down. We can't be sure. A variety of dates have been proposed, ranging from roughly 700 to 1025. That is, one scholar, Kevin Kiernan, professor emeritus, now at University of Kentucky. Kevin Kiernan thinks that the manuscript that we have actually shows the creator of Beowulf creating it, revising it as he goes. And that thus it's like what's called holograph. It's written in the author's own hands. He argues along those lines that the Beowulf we have today is really a couple of separate poems that this person gets and kind of cobbles together and makes into a single poem. And this isn't a new idea. This idea is about 150 years old. It goes back to about the 1870s. Okay, it's a updating of what's called the Introductory, or the theory of lays. That Beowulf is a mix of little lays, little short songs. And there is some evidence within the poem to support that. And I don't mean evidence where you take the poem all apart, that kind of thing. But there are some passages in the poem where the poet talks about stories of Beowulf. And he uses stories, plural, tales of Beowulf that have kind of been circulated. Okay? So this issue, the issue of the date of the poem, is huge in Beowulf studies. Because how you date the poem, or when you date the poem, can radically affect how you interpret the poem. If the poem is really early, if the poem dates from this period, let's say, then it is much, much closer to pagan Germanic culture, the kind of culture that is portrayed in the poem, than it is to classical Anglo-Saxon Christian culture that is around here. Because keep in mind, 1000 AD, what happened 60 years later? 66 years later. The Norman conquest. And Anglo-Saxon England, for all intents and purposes, ends. So if Beowulf is written here at 1025, then Beowulf is written seemingly right as Anglo-Saxon England is about to be decapitated. One way to understand that is to say, if Beowulf is written in 1025, then Anglo-Saxon England hasn't already reached its peak and is going on the downhill slide. Anglo-Saxon England is just now reaching its peak. And then the Normans come in and cut it off. If it's written here, then there might be a little peaking after that, but you're already on the downward slide, and it's okay for the Norman conquest to occur because there's nothing really good that's going to come out of the remainder of Anglo-Saxon England. It's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, from what we talked about 2 weeks ago, what happens between 700 and 1000 AD in Anglo-Saxon England? Beginning right around 793 or so. Anybody remember? Viking invasions. And they go on for roughly 2 centuries. Coming in, attacking, going out. Coming in, attacking, going out. Again and again and again and again. Who is the poem about? What are the nationalities involved?
Celts.
Not the Celts. Danes, the Gates, or Yats, or Geats, or however you want to pronounce it. You'll hear all different pronunciations. Okay.
Swedish.
Swedes. Okay. Danes and Swedes, they're Vikings. And how does the poem discuss the Danes and such? The great honor Danes, the shield Danes, the victory. it's puffing up their character. They're wonderful people. How do you write a poem about these people who are raiding, ransacking, pillaging your countryside, and write a poem about them that says they're just wonderful people? While that's happening. Yes.
Okay, so are you saying that if the writing of Beowulf occurred closer to 700 AD, then Beowulf itself marks whether or not there was a peak in Anglo-Saxon culture or not?
The way some critics address that is, whenever Beowulf was composed, that's pretty much the peak. That's the high water mark.
Okay.
Because nothing else in Anglo-Saxon literature meets the technical brilliance, let's say, of Beowulf. Now, there are other poems that are nearly as long, and there are other poems that are nearly as good, but there's no other Beowulf. Okay? And like I tell my graduate students when I teach the Old English course, the reason you take Old English is to read Beowulf. You don't learn Old English just to read the other Old English poems. You learn Old English to read Beowulf because it's the greatest thing written in the Anglo-Saxon language. It's almost like, you learn King James English to do what? To read King James Bible. Shakespeare didn't walk around speaking King James English. Shakespeare didn't write necessarily in King James English. The King James English that's used in the Bible in the translation of 1611 is intentionally archaic. People by that time are already saying things like, I go to the store rather than I goeth. Or he goes to the store rather than he goeth. Or they would not say in everyday colloquial speech, my cup runneth over. They would say my cup runs over. Or my cup is overfilling even. Okay? So, like the King James English, even the language of Beowulf, it's archaic. Now, it might be archaic because it's composed back here, or it might be archaic because it's composed somewhere in this range, or even 900 AD to 1000 AD. And the poet is, like the King James translators, using an archaic form of the language intentionally. Not to say how we're going to trick people 1,000 years from now. Okay, well, I'm not talking, creationism kind of a thing. But this idea that we're going to use a form of the language that's slightly older and slightly out of vogue. We have a good example of a modern author who did the exact same thing. J.R.R. Tolkien with The Lord of the Rings. You can't read Lord of the Rings and say this is 1940s British usage. It's not. It's more like 1840s British usage, mimicking 1340s British usage. That is, Tolkien harkens back to a much earlier period in terms of the sound of the language he uses, the construction and syntax of the sentences, the whole 9 yards. Okay? So, date of the poem. Very, very crucial. Now, another issue in terms of the criticism of the poem that's related to the date is this notion that there is a tension between Christianity and paganism in the poem. That there is a pull in the poem in these two different directions. Personally, I don't think there is any tension. Because I think what the poet is doing sees Christianity and paganism kind of within a broader framework. Okay? And what the poet is doing is that, this is my interpretation, is that the poet is a Christian, writing for a Christian audience. But the poet is looking backwards in time to a time, the world of Beowulf, that is not Christian. There is nothing in the world of Beowulf. And by that I mean the setting of the poem. Because again, the setting of the poem is roughly 6th century Germany, Denmark. Okay? Which historically, at this period, it's pagan. Christianity has not reached this area at this time. England becomes Christian first. England sends missionaries to Germany. St. Boniface, the guy who came up with the idea of the Christmas tree, he was an English missionary who was sent to Saxony in about 800 AD. So England has been Christian for roughly 2 centuries before Christianity reaches northern Germany and the Scandinavian lands. Okay? So a lot of people say, well, there's this huge tension then between Christianity and paganism. Well, there's no tension for one reason, because there is no real overt Christianity, let's say, in the poem. You don't hear Jesus. You don't hear Mary. You don't hear names of the saints. You don't hear any of the commandments. You don't have any reference to the church at all. What do you hear reference to?
The maker.
God.
Yeah.
At times called God, at other times called Shippend, the shaper, the maker, the measurer, the all-father, Odin-like, okay, the ruler of glory, the king of glory, the ruler of men, all of those kinds of little epithets and such, okay? And the pagan, you do not have references to the Norse or Germanic gods in the poem. Not one. There's no reference to Loki. There's no reference to Thor or Thunor. There's no reference to Odin or Frey or Freya. Okay? None of them. What you do have reference to is God. And then over here, you have the soul slayer. This one very, very famous passage that we'll talk about. Okay? But we do see elements of paganism. For example, Beowulf's burial. That's a pagan burial. When you put a guy on a funeral pyre and you load him up with treasure and light him on fire, that's not Christian. Okay? Christian burial up until the 20th century. From the advent of the church until the 20th century, Christian burial is what's called inhumation. You put the body intact in the ground. Okay? It's only with the 20th century that you begin to see cremations of Christians. Okay? Pagan burials are light them up and torch them. Sometimes you get the elements of them being put on boats and sent off to the ocean. Okay? Or, like Shield Sheving, put on a boat, not lit on fire, sent off to the ocean. See, historically and archaeologically, it's kind of hard to prove Viking burials of guys being put on a boat, launched out to sea. And if you ever saw the, I think it was the one King Arthur film where the guy stands with a flaming arrow, 500 yards away, hits the boat. Okay? Why is that hard to prove? What evidence would you have left? The Vikings did not actually write much down about their actions. Okay? The Celts didn't write anything. So there would really be no evidence. A hand was up back there.
Am I dreaming this, or were there mention of demons?
Yes.
That kind of makes me.
The word demon is used an awful lot, in fact. Referring to Grendel. Okay? But Grendel isn't a demon as we think of demon in popular consciousness today. Because what is a demon? What would a demon be today?
Spiritual entity that possesses.
A spiritual entity. In other words, can you rip an arm off a spiritual entity?
No.
No, Grendel was once a real person.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can't, and you can't stab a ghost or a demon. But, it doesn't do anything to them. Okay? So the poet will use demon to describe Grendel. He'll use demon. The poet will use evil spirit. Okay. And he'll also call him a wretched man. So is the poet just confused? Does he not know what he's really trying to say? No. The poet is using a bunch of different synonyms. I mean, we will talk about people today sometimes as being demonic. Do we literally mean demonic? If somebody says Hitler was demonic, do they mean literally? Sometimes they do. What do they mean other times?
He was just a really bad example of what mankind is.
He represented ultimate evil in human form.
You know, if you read C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters,
I love that.
okay? Read Screwtape. In the preface to Screwtape, Lewis talks about writing it. And then he talked a little bit about writing it also in a couple of letters. And somebody asked him, how could you get into the mind of evil so easily? And he said, what do you mean? Just try. It's getting into the mind of goodness or good that's hard. But becoming evil, what do? Just let yourself go. That's it. All those inhibitions that we put upon ourselves, or society puts upon us, or our religious values put up, whatever, set them at the door and just kind of let your mind go wild. And he says, that's how I wrote Screwtape. Okay? Now, Grendel is descended from a man. What man? Cain. Long descended from Cain. Okay? Is he a man still? How big is Grendel?
Huge.
Big enough to eat someone in a single bite. That is, picks up a person and head to toe in the mouth. Okay, so Grendel's not like 9 feet tall. He's probably not like 19 feet tall. He's huge. Right? This is important because we're told he can eat a whole bunch of men and still be hungry. Now, there may be figurative language going on there, saying something about the ravenousness of evil, etc., but who knows? Okay? So, Christian versus pagan is another huge theme. Another one. What makes a good king? Or who is a good king? What are the values or what are the characteristics of a good king?
Sharing treasure.
Pardon?
Sharing treasure.
Sharing treasure. I mean, in Germanic society, if a king receives treasure as a result of winning a battle, what is it incumbent upon the king to do? To give it back. To give it to the men who won the treasure in battle. And we're going to see very clearly in the poem a king who did not distribute treasure, who did not dispense gifts. And his own people rise up and kill him, which is a huge no-no in Germanic society. In fact, let me take this time to point out what's called the fourfold Germanic ethic. Okay? And what's meant by that is these are 4 central ideas to Germanic society. These are 4 things that all Germanic people would have known down deep in their bones, as it were. Okay? And this is from C.L. Wren, A Study of Old English, which is a very old book, but personally, I still think it's one of the best there is. Okay? The first one is duty to your Lord. Now, your Lord might be the the particular chieftain of your clan. Or your lord might be your king. Okay? But you have a duty to your lord. 2, your duty to kin. Obviously, those are people that you're related to. They're your nuclear family and your extended family. They are your clan, to use a Celtic term. Okay? Extended family meaning cousins, second cousins, third cousins, fourth, 8 times removed, etc. My kids would say, it'd be like our duty to defend Queen Elizabeth because we're really, all that kind of stuff. Okay? I mean, it's that kind of thing. 3, this is where you get a rub in this Germanic ethic. Duty to avenge your lord and or your kin. So if something happens to your lord, it is your responsibility to avenge your lord. If something happens to a member of your family, it's your responsibility to avenge them. Notice what this immediately brings in. The idea of feud. Okay? But what happens if somebody in your family goes against your lord? Lord should win out, but how do you avenge then your lord against a member of your family? Because if you go against a member of your family, you run into this one. And so you get this competition between these poles, as it were. And the last one is a reliance or emphasis on weird. Weird. Which is, it's almost a religious idea in Germanic society. This idea of I think the best way to explain it is what will be, which isn't quite the same as fate, because you can, as Beowulf will say, you can work with weird. You can kind of help turn weird your way, but you have to be actively involved. Okay? And we're going to see tension in these throughout the poem. And what I think the tension is going to show is this doesn't work. It doesn't work as a way or as a means of governing a society. Okay? Well, look at the poem. What happens at the end? Beowulf dies. Beowulf becomes king. And we're going to be told by the messenger what is going to happen once the rest of the world finds out Beowulf is now king. The Swedes are going to attack. The Franks are going to attack. And what is going to happen to the Geats? Okay. Historically, the Geats were real people. That is, there was a real land of people who collectively called themselves the Geats or Gates or Yeats, depending on your pronunciation. That land, place, people existed in 500, 600, 700, possibly 800, but by 1000 AD, they're gone. Nobody knows where. Nobody knows really what happened to them. Unless, of course, you read Beowulf. Because Beowulf tells you exactly what's going to happen to them. They're going to become annihilated. They will become a non-people. Okay? Because of this. This will destroy them. Which is why I think in the poem we come to a spot where Beowulf has been king for 50 years. And he gets ready to fight the dragon, and he goes off to fight the dragon. And as he's making his way to fight the dragon, he keeps stopping and telling stories about the past. Well, why does he do that? What's he telling us? In those sections where he's stopping and telling us things, he's telling us how he ruled. And how does his rule compare with all the other kings we've seen. His rule is marked by 50 years of what? Peace. Peace. Okay? We don't see that anywhere else in any of the kings that are talked about in the poem. Okay? So, that then gets involved in the question, what makes a good king? And is Beowulf a good king? Is Hrothgar a good king? Was Hermod a good king? What of these kings, if any, were bad? And if they were bad, why? And what is the poet telling us about kingship? Okay? There's a whole bunch of other issues, in the poem, or critical issues about the poem. Not only the dating, who wrote it? We've actually had some scholars in the last 15, 20 years who have tried to say very particular individuals wrote the poem. And they give all kinds of evidence. Okay? Problem is, none of it is conclusive. It's all circumstantial. We don't have any manuscript that says, I, Alfred, wrote the poem that has come to be known as Beowulf, because even the manuscript doesn't have a title. It doesn't say Beowulf at the top. It doesn't say anything before the poem begins. Okay? The manuscript is kind of interesting, however, for what it does contain. It has this poem about Beowulf. It's got the life of St. Christopher. Okay? Anybody know anything about the life of St. Christopher? What was St. Christopher? He was a giant. Okay? It has a book in it called The Wonders of the East. Okay? It has Alexander's letters to Aristotle, where Alexander is writing about his journey off to the east and all the cool things he sees, dog-headed men and all this kind of stuff. Okay? And a couple of other things. What marks each of and the last thing in the manuscript, Judith. About the Jewish heroine, Judith, who kills a man who is terrorizing her people, named Holofernes, by cutting his head off, as he thinks he's going to get to enjoy sex with her. Okay? What some people have called the manuscript, is a Liber Monstrorum, or a book of monsters. Because everything in the manuscript has monsters of one kind or another. And keep in mind, a Jewish woman beheading a general, that's monstrous. Women weren't supposed to kill men in this time period, even if they were going to be raped. Okay? Okay, let's 518. Let's start looking at the poem. So open your books to whatever page it's on in yours, since I don't have the right one.
60.
147? Oh, 47? Yeah, that's what it is in this one. But if you've got the concise volume A, it's on a different page. The first word in the poem gives you an opportunity to play interpreter. Because the first word in the poem is what? What? And nobody has a good way to translate that. Now, not because this one word is just rife with symbolic meaning, and if you blow this, you blow the entire 3,182 lines. No. It's because this serves as a purpose in the poem. Probably it is an oral reminder to an audience to listen up. How do we get people to listen in a large crowd today? Shh. So where you at? Shh. How else do we?
Whistle.
Whistle. Some people say, hey! You might, if it's a genteel crowd and you're having dinners, you might, if you have, crystal. Doesn't really work well with bottles, You get the ding, 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 ding. Okay? That's what this is designed to do. Now, put yourself in an Anglo-Saxon time period. Let's say the poem is composed, say 900 AD, and it's now 925, and it's February 7th, and let's say you're somewhere in the Midlands to northern England, and it's cold, and everybody's kind of huddled around the fire, and you've had a good meal, you've had some boar, and the ale has gone around, and it's not this wimpy American sissy stuff. It's good English strong ale, about 12-15% alcohol by volume. And you're drinking tankards of this stuff. So you're nearly slaughtered, okay? You got to get everybody's attention to get them to shut up. What? We Gardena. In year the goom, third kinning thrum ye frunen, who the arthling is elith fremadon. Okay, that's the opening lines in Old English. We have heard, notice immediately the tense. It's past. We have heard of the glory and bygone days of the folk kings of the Spear Danes, how those noble lords did lofty deeds. The speaker immediately takes us to the past. Glorious deeds done by the kings of the Spear Danes in long ago days. The word there is in Yeardagum. Literally, your days of. In days of yore. Okay? That's where that phrase kind of comes from in later literature. And then we hear the opening of the poem. Now, all of this is what's called the prologue. The first 52 lines are essentially a prologue. Often Scyld-Sheving seized the mead benches from many tribes, troops of enemies, struck fear into earls. Now, what does that mean? He seized the mead benches. Does that mean he went into the neighboring tribes and said, excuse me, can I borrow your mead benches? We're out of them at our place and we need more. No! What it means is he deprived them of their mead benches. It doesn't mean he made them stand and took them. It means he killed them all. Okay? He seized the mead benches from many tribes. That's a euphemism in terms of the translation. This is, at various points I'm going to make little nitpicky comments about Roy's translation. This is part I don't like. He doesn't just take their mead benches away from them. Like, I don't like playing with you anymore. I'm going to take my ball and go away. That's not what he's doing. He is seizing their mead benches, meaning he's seizing their halls. Why? Because they're dead. Now, this is Scyld-Sheving. The troops of enemies, he struck fear into earls. Well, Esoda monithum mauthum medo fela doesn't just mean he struck fear. Let's use a modern term. He terrorized the neighboring nations. So, Scyld-Sheving, modern terminology, was a terrorist. Okay? Make it more real. What did he do? He went to neighboring countrysides. I'm trying to think if I have a map. I don't think it's on this computer. He went to neighboring countrysides, or the neighboring coastlines, and attacked. That is, he expanded his kingdom. He created a buffer zone of peace, let's say. Though he first was found a waif, I wish you wouldn't use words like waif. What's another better word for waif? Orphan? Foundling? Foundling literally means one that was found. Okay? So he was abandoned, let's say. He was found a waif. He awaited solace for that. He grew under heaven, prospered in honor, until all of the encircling nations had to obey him, grant him tribute. All the nations that surrounded his country owed him tribute. That is, he rattled his sword, they sent money. He rattled his sword again, they send more money. That's a pretty important little detail here. That means shield shoving is so fearsome that they send money just to stop him from rattling his sword. Now it's kind of interesting because depending upon when you date the poem, if you date the poem as having been written sometime, let's say, 800 to 975, when the Viking invasions are going on, one of the things Vikings demanded of the English was tribute. Send us tribute, we won't attack. Okay? The king that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, Athelred. Okay? Athelred. In 991, poem that I had on the original syllabus and that took out. In 991 or 990, he agreed to pay tribute to the Vikings, in return for which they would not attack. Well, in 991, a group of Vikings did attack on the northeast shore of England. And a local chieftain by the name of Beowulf, okay, an older advisor and warrior in the settlement of Malden, Beowulf and his feared fought a battle against the Vikings and lost. They got slaughtered. They didn't need to fight them because the tribute had already been paid. But Beowulf, to defend English honor, fought anyways. Okay? So you open the poem with this talk about tribute, and I can't help but think that it probably brought to the mind of an Anglo-Saxon audience, definitely at this time when the poem was copied down into the manuscript, Vikings. So the encircling nations over the whale's writing, that is the ocean, had to obey him to grant him tribute. The whale's writing. That's an example of what? Kinning. A kinning is a deliberately ambiguous figure of speech. Okay? It is a means to denote something without being specific. Best way I can describe it is it's a metaphor of a metaphor. Okay? Metaphor, comparison of two things without using like or as. So then you make another metaphor of that metaphor. So, the whale road. Prawn rada is the Old English. Well, what's the road that the whale traverses? There is no road that the whale traverses. But the whale lives in the ocean. So you have prawn rada, and we also will see swan rada. The swan road. Okay. Similarly, you have day red. Dawn. Okay. Hilde Leocht. Hildeleoht. Hilda, battle, Leocht, light. battle light, sword play. I mean, even sword play is almost a kinning. Is it really, you're playing with swords? No. Okay. And battle light, it's thought, might be an actual reference to sparks off of swords striking each other. So then what does the poet do when he finishes this opening few lines about Scyld-Sheving? Scyld-Sheving, who terrorized his neighbors, who forced them to give him tribute. That was a good king. The Old English is that was good king. This phrase, or a variant thereof, will be used 2 more times in the poem. Okay? One about Hrothgar, but it's going to begin, that was good king, which means, but he was a good king. This time it says he was a good king. Okay? So notice, the poet tells us, this is a good king. Terrorize your neighbors, kill them and steal their mead benches, or take their halls, or their lands, and force those that are still alive to pay you tribute. That's a good king. Okay, what kind of society? Obviously. Martial. Okay? A very warrior society. And then we hear that he later on has a son, and that son is named Beowulf. No, that's not the Beowulf that the poem is named after. This is another Beowulf. Okay, this is like Beowulf 1, as it were. But it is kind of interesting with the poet bringing up this Beowulf, because look at what we're told. A boy was later born to him, young in the courts, whom God sent as a solace to the people. And yet we never hear anything about what this Beowulf does to become a solace to the people. He, God, saw their need, the dire distress they had endured, lordless, for such a long time. The Lord of life, wielder of glory, gave him worldly honor. Beowulf, the son of Scyld, was renowned. His fame spread wide in Scandinavian lands. And then we get a little gnomic passage, okay, which means it's wisdom. It's like a proverb. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions, so that later in life, loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. The people will support him with praiseworthy deeds. A man will prosper among any people. Now, every time I read this, and I've read it a lot over the last 20 years, there's something in it that makes me think maybe the poet really does intend us to think of Beowulf, the hero who kills Grendel and Grendel's mother, because of what he says there in that gnomic passage. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possession. In other words, thus should a young man reap good results from giving gifts that were his father's. Well, what is one of the marks of a good king? Not that we've just heard about Scyld-Sheving, but from what we know about Germanic society, the dispensing of gifts. It's why a king is almost always called a ring giver or gold giver. Okay? So that later in life, loyal comrades will stand behind him when war comes. Well, what happens to Beowulf, whom the poem is named for, later in life? What happens when he fights the dragon? Why does he fight alone? Is he there all by himself? Or does he have a troop of warriors with him? He has a troop of warriors with him. The poem tells us he chooses the best of his men to go with him. But when he gets ready to fight the dragon, he orders them. He says, you guys stay put. This is for me to fight, for me to do. Why? Because I'm Beowulf. I'm the monster killer. You guys aren't. Okay? But even with that, one of them goes and helps him. But none of the others do. And when Beowulf dies, the one who helps him, Beowulf, then goes back to the other 11, and says, man, what a waste of armor and swords Beowulf gave to you. Back when we used to drink with him in the hall, and we promised, yeah, Beowulf, we'll be with you. Because I asked you to come help, and not one of you lifted a finger. Okay? And yet here the poem says, right in the opening, thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions. Why? So that later in life, loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. The people will support him. The people did not support Beowulf. Our Beowulf. Okay? So then we're told, Scyld passes away. Notice, at his appointed hour. That is not a pagan Germanic idea. That is a Christian idea. That each person has a set time on the clock, so to speak. As far as I know, my time has more than a couple seconds left. But it could happen that 10 seconds from now, I drop dead. In which case, my time would be up and you'd be out for the rest of the semester. So what do? They bear him down to the sea, and we get a description of Scyld's burial. This description is important for a variety of reasons. Okay? It tells us something about Germanic burials, which prior to J.R.R. Tolkien's Beowulf Monsters and the Critics essay is one of the reasons people read Beowulf. But also because in 1938, I think it was 38, might have been 36. In 1938, there was a coroner's inquest in London that was arranged to determine who would get this massive amount of treasure that was discovered at a burial site in eastern England. A woman named Elizabeth Petty, I think in 1936, had a guy dig up some mounds that were on her property. This is called Sutton Hoo. Okay? And in these mounds was discovered, hold on a second. I don't want the projector to come down. Screen's what I want. Up. Computer. Show to class. Lights go down. In this discovery, okay, actually, let me put the screen back down. At Sutton Hoo, this was her, it was like a farm, okay? And here's a pretty good example of one of the mounds. There are over 20 of these on her territory, or on her land. And she asked this guy, I think his name was something like Basil Brown. She asked him, he was a local archaeologist, to dig this place up. And so he did. And what he found was this in one of the largest mounds. It's a 90-foot long Viking ship. I take that back. It's not Viking. It's a 90-foot long ship. Okay? And what you're seeing here are remnants of the wood, and the little lines right along there, those aren't actually lines. Those are the is rust coloration in the sand of the rivets. Okay. So he discovered this when he opened it up. And what he discovered actually in the thing were things like this. Okay. Which one is that? Is that the... Yeah, that's the shoulder clasp. Okay. This is called cloisonné work. And if you look really closely, like right in here, you can see little lines going back and forth. Those lines are gold thread, gold wire that underlay these pieces of garnet, lapis lazuli, and even these. Okay, that is made by blowing glass, forming it into squares, forming it together, and notice you've got white, black, kind of a bluish, and another blue in the middle, and then slicing it, like less than the thickness of a nail. And then insetting it into, this is all gold, into this gold, and then you have this garnet laid over gold thread. All of this is gold, solid gold. It's not like gold plated, okay? And so all of this treasure is discovered. Okay, this is part of the belt buckle. The belt buckle is about this long. Okay, it's about that wide, about that long, about that thick, solid gold. Weighs, if I remember right, like about 4 pounds. Okay, and what looks like, black dirty areas in here, it's not. It's called niello. It's inlaid stone in this. I mean, this treasure was amazing. So what we had, here's an example of the Sutton Hoo helmet. A lot of this, like this stuff in here, this is just leather. This is the actual part that remained. This is gold. Okay. That might be a dragon, some think, or it might be a swan. Okay, eyebrow pieces, cheek plates, okay, all of this kind of stuff done. What was found was this glorious treasure. Gold coins, Merovingian coins. Here's the belt buckle. I mean, look at the interlace work of this. And you actually can trace the beginning to the end, okay, in all of this. So he does this archaeological dig, finds all this treasure, and they have to have a coroner's inquest. Why? They have to determine why the material was put in the ground. Because the reason for why it was put in the ground will determine who it belongs to. Okay? If it's burial, that is, if it is determined that it was put in the ground to remain with a dead person and never to be dug up again, then it becomes the person upon whose property it was found. If it was determined to be treasure, that is, it was buried and intended to be dug up again. Somebody buried it because the Vikings were coming, as an example, and with the intent of going back and digging it up again, then it becomes the property of the crown. Right? So you have to have a coroner's inquest. Well, what's a coroner going to do? There's no body left. English soil is very acidic. If there was a body, it completely rotted. So, one of the pieces of evidence that was used in the coroner's inquest was this passage from Beowulf. Because this passage from Beowulf, beginning around line 30 and going down to 45 or so, describes exactly what they were seeing. We have a standard that is a thing that you would put lamps on. Okay, we've got gold coins. This is a purse lid. Okay, again, gold and cloisonné work. We had fittings for a big old giant drinking horn. I mean, this sucker would hold like 3 or 4 pints. Huge. We have a helmet. We had parts of a sword. There was, let's see if they're showing any of the others. These are the shoulder clasps. That's the map of Sutton Hoo. These elements of a shield. This is entirely, by the way, probably a decorative shield. Just as the helmet was probably an ornamental helmet. This thing was not actually created to be worn into battle. Okay.
How tall were those mounts when they started?
This one, if I remember right, it's about 25, 30 feet. Okay. The one that this is the one with the ship burial. The nearest water to this is about 2 miles away, uphill. So what they had to do is they sailed the ship up the River Devon, and then they had to roll it. So what you have to do is you cut trees, put them on the ground as rollers, and you push and pull the boat. And when you get past one tree log, you then have guys pick it up, run around to the front, put it down, and you keep doing that. Okay, this is easy, 2 miles. Stonehenge. Okay, some of the blocks of stone for Stonehenge come from Wales, about 150 miles away from Stonehenge. It was moved by water, we're pretty sure, and then over land, probably by roller. Several miles. I think like 50 miles at least by roller. And those suckers weigh anywhere from like 5 to 25 tons. Okay? Hand.
How many of these pieces would have been worn on a consistent basis?
That's a good question, because a lot of this we think, for example, these and these, it's probably indicative that this is what's called a high value burial. That is, the person who was buried here was a king or a very, very wealthy chieftain. And that these were probably worn for ceremonial purposes. Not, I'm just going to get up one morning and put on my gold. He wouldn't wear this stuff every day. Similarly with the helmet, that it would be a ceremonial helmet. And we actually think, pretty good idea, of who was buried here. Excuse me, who was commemorated here. That is, the idea is that a person was not actually put inside this ship. And this ship was not just, Viking longship like this, where you then have a mast and a big square sail, okay? But this was the kind of ship that had essentially a house or a hut right in the middle. And the reason they believe that is because the way the artifacts lay when it was discovered, it appears that things were hung on the walls. And then when they buried the ship, as the weight of the earth compacted everything down and everything rotted, okay, this is what was found. Another discovery about 10 years ago on the southeast coast of England, they actually found a similar burial without a ship, but as they dug down, they found, when they dug their trench, items like, they found bodies here, but they also found items over here, indicating that there had once been a wall, okay, and it now just stuck essentially in the side of the dirt. But there is, we don't have time to talk about all this, there is, all kinds of stuff at Sutton Hoo. There are big bowls. One of them is about this big in diameter. Okay. There's a 3-foot in diameter silver plate from Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt. And there are 2 spoons, one of which has inscribed in Greek letters, Greek letters. No, in Latin letters. Saulos, S-A-U-L-O-S. And the other one has Paulos, P-A-U-L-O-S, which have been interpreted as baptismal spoons. Saul to Paul. But the person we think that was commemorated here was the king that Bede mentioned in that passage that we talked about, Radwald. Kind of interesting because Radwald was a guy who apostatized from the faith. That is, he became a Christian, and then he wasn't so sure about it. So he had erected a Christian shrine, and right next to it, separate building, but right next to it, a pagan shrine. So he could go pray to God, and he could go pray to the pagan gods and kind of cover his bets. Right? But he was wealthy. Here's another image. Well, here's a good one. Gives you an idea of how high the mound is, because look at the sheep. Now, the sheep were about 3 feet tall, so it's a good 20 feet or so. My wife and I went there in 2002, and it's amazing. I mean, you can walk all around and everything and see quite a few of the mounds. Most of the mounds have been excavated, and then they recover them back up. Some of the artifacts from Sutton Hoo are actually there at the Visitor Center. Most of them, however, are at the British Museum. The inquest, the coroner's inquest, did determine this was burial. So it's all hers. She immediately turned it over to the government. She said, no, it's not mine. This belongs to the country. I mean, it was called at the time, it was called up until just a couple of years ago, the greatest archaeological discovery in England, ever. I mean, ever. Okay. Since then, there have been a few others, like entire Roman amphitheaters have been discovered. Okay, that would seat 5,000 people. One of those was discovered in Wales. Another massive gold discovery just a couple of years ago in Staffordshire. Okay. So that's the importance of this passage in terms of kind of current history or modern history. Okay. So then we jump into the poem itself. We get out of the prologue, and just before we do, we find out Beowulf dies, and we get his description of his burial. And we're told, they set a golden ensign high over his head, let the waves have him, gave him to the deep. Men do not know how to say truly, not trusted counselors, nor heroes under the heavens, who received that cargo. They push him off into the ocean, and he goes wherever. Okay? Excuse me, that's when Scyld dies. So then Beowulf reigns for a long time. Okay? And after him, we're told, arose the great Halfdane. Now, Halfdane is an historical figure. We know he existed. We don't know that his father was named Beowulf. Okay? And Halfdane has 4 children. 3 sons and a daughter. Okay? Let's pick up. Right. No. Stop. Lights. It doesn't seem this light in here. So Halfdane has 4 children, and we're given their names. And I'm just going to use this spelling. Halfdane. 4. What's the order? Harogar, Hrothgar, and Helga the Good. So we have Harogar, Hrothgar, Helga, and the daughter isn't named. Actually, in the poem, in the manuscript, it reads their names off, and it says, I heard that, and literally in the manuscript there's a blank space. The name just isn't given. I heard that, and then blank. Okay? Holger the Good. And I heard that so-and-so off. Stupid thing. Thank you. I heard that so-and-so was Onula's queen. We know from other sources that this person is probably Yrsa. Okay? Because Onula is referred to in a whole bunch of other stories, as is Halfdan. And Yrsa is mentioned in other stories. Okay? And notice what we're told. We're told that she was Onula's queen, dear bedfellow of the battle shilving. Now we're going to meet Onula at the end of the poem, the last several hundred lines. Until then, he doesn't really figure in very much. So what are we told? Nothing about Harogar. Success in battle is given to Hrothgar, and he becomes king. So that his beloved kinsmen, we're told, eagerly served him until the young soldiers grew into a mighty troop of men. And when his young soldiers grow into a mighty troop of men, what does he think? I want to build a hall. I don't want to build just any hall. I want to build the world's greatest hall. That he should have men make a great mead house, which the sons of men should remember forever. And there inside he would share everything with young and old that God had given him, telling us he's a good king, except for the common land and the lives of men. Well, what's the common land? The land that the people hold in common. Okay? He can't give that away. Why? It's not his. Okay? And the lives of men. What does Hrothgar not trade in? Slaves. Kind of an interesting little detail. And so then we're told the work was performed swiftly. It came to pass. The greatest hall of men was built. He gave it the name Heorot, which means heart. And notice your little footnote. An object recovered from the burial mound at Sutton Hoo, perhaps a royal insignia, is surmounted by the image of a heart. And the object is actually a 3-foot-long piece of stone. It's been called a whetstone, like a stone used for sharpening the sword. But it has a funny little cap on the bottom. Looks like this. There's a funny little cap on the bottom. And then you have this long stone, and it's shaped kind of like that. And then at the top, there's this thing like this with 4 legs and a somewhat fat deer with stags in the little tail. Right? And that's pretty much what it looks like. Now, one scholar says, this isn't a whetstone. This is like an imperius. The kind of thing an emperor would hold, and this is designed to sit on the kneecap. This is like a symbol of royal authority, this guy thinks. Okay? So the hall gets built, and what are we told? He remembered his boast. He gave out rings, treasure at table. The hall towered high and horn-gabled. It's just been built, the narrator tells us. Like they just did the ribbon-cutting ceremony. People are plowing in. It awaited hostile fires, the surges of war. The time was not yet near that the sword hate of sworn in-laws should arise after ruthless violence. So they're just now throwing, the Super Bowl victory party. And we hear what's going to happen to this great hall. It's going to burn down. By whom? In-laws. Those of you who have in-laws know what the poet's talking about. Sorry. Okay. Okay. The sword hate of sworn in-laws. This is a story that we know about from other Germanic literature. The in-between between Hrothgar and his nephew Hrothulf. Hrothgar and his son-in-law Froda. Okay? There's also some with Hrothulf. We'll talk about that later. I've got 6 o'clock. Let's take a break and come back in 10 minutes.